I'm Atul Kumar, a fellow at ORF. Today, it's our pleasure to host Professor Tai Ming Cheung. Professor Tai is director of the Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation at University of California, and he's also a professor at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. Today, Professor Tai is going to talk about China and Xi Jinping's strategies for technological and security supremacy, and he'll be explaining the whole concept of China's techno-security state. So, Professor, about 30, 35 minutes?
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you, Atul, and thank you to the Observer Research Foundation for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I hear it's like I got here just as everyone is coming back from the holidays itself. So it's doing this or having to respond to your emails. It's a great pleasure that you chose listening to me, and hopefully you don't regret that decision by the end of the event. So what I'm going to do is to spend the next half an hour to provide sort of a high-level overview about what I would say has been taking place over the last sort of 12 years since Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, and what he has focused on building. And where right now we're sort of like still midway through his project of building a technologically advanced, increasingly strong and prosperous Chinese state that is looking to become sort of like a challenger to the US for global power and for sort of global influence. And the way that Xi Jinping is doing this is building what I define as a techno-security state, which is where security and innovation and economic development comes together through a top-down, state-led model of party-state development. And I would say that when we look at sort of all the sort of geostrategic, geoeconomic, geopolitical developments and competition that is taking place in the world, the techno-security area, where technology and security is sort of in competition, this is probably the most consequential and sort of the most dangerous area for competition between the US and its allies and China and its allies. I mean, there's a lot of sort of concepts and terms that we use both in academia and in the media to sort of describe what the new sort of geostrategic and geoeconomic landscape is in terms of US-China competition. One of the favorite phrases that is used is that sort of the world is in a new Cold War. And what that means is that there's the new Cold War and there's the old Cold War. And the old Cold War, sort of that provides this comparative perspective, is sort of the struggle that the US had with the Soviet Union back in the second half of the 20th century. And there are important similarities, but important differences between what we see today between the US and China and with sort of what we saw sort of 50, 60 years ago between the US and the Soviet Union. And what I would do is begin to sort of identify the similarities and the differences, but focus on the differences, and then from there, sort of like give you an understanding of why these differences are important, and how do we see that in terms of what's going on in China. So, and as an academic, what we like to do is to provide sort of like frameworks of analysis, ways to sort of like, instead of just describing what is going on, provide a framework that allows you to analyze and make sense of what sort of like the key areas, the key concepts, and to use that to sort of not just look at what is going on today, but how to apply that for the next decade or 2 decades itself. And the concept that I sort of developed is this notion of what I call the Techno-Security State. So sort of often we get sort of like, there's different terms that are thrown about in terms of what a state does. There's, in Europe, for example, often it's like we call states welfare states, or sort of like, or economic-centric states, where the state is focused on sort of like, on social development, on sort of like emphasizing prosperity and economic growth. But there are sort of states that are focused on other issues, such as sort of like sort of national security or technology development. And in terms of China and a number of other states, it's like, I mean, they are what I would are techno-security states, which we define as sort of like states that are innovation-centered, security-maximizing regimes that prioritize the building of technological and defense capabilities to meet expansive national security needs, in large part because of threat perceptions from elsewhere, and also domestically, the influence of national security coalitions. I mean, that definition, I would say, describes China, but it also describes countries such as North Korea, Israel, and Russia, and even sort of the US itself. So while I'm talking about China, this techno-security state, it's a much broader concept. And I would say that the techno-security state in the second decade of the 21st century is becoming more and more sort of like widespread, as opposed to before sort of like the world began to focus on conflict itself. So to go back, it's so when I was talking about the old Cold War, the Cold War of the second half of the 20th century, we often think about it in terms of the Soviet Union and the US, from a defense, from an ideological competition. But I would say it's a more sort of holistic way to look at what had taken place during the second half of the 20th century, was that the US found itself in great power competition with the Soviet Union on one hand, on the defense and ideological side, but the US was also involved in a great power competition with Japan. And this was with Japan, especially in the 70s and 80s and 90s. But that was in the commercial, the geo-economic sphere. Japan was, with its sort of like economic, sort of post-World War II economic development, became a formidable sort of commercial actor itself. And so the US faced these two countries. And, but these two countries, they were very, very different in terms of how they were organized and their relations with the US. Japan was a treaty partner. They had very close security and political ties with the US, even though they were competing on the economic side. The Soviet Union had very little engagement with the US. And importantly, sort of Japan and the Soviet Union, there was very little sort of like interactions between them. There was a very, very sort of like sort of robust and rigid dividing line. So there was very little overlap between the Soviet Union and Japan. And so what this meant is that when the US was engaging in geostrategic and geo-economic competition during the second half of the 20th century, the US was facing sort of two different countries, and sort of like and to do this, the U.S. was much more integrated. The U.S. Techno-Security State, during this Cold War, had both the defense component, and the U.S. defense industrial apparatus was very, very powerful, was sort of like the most innovative of any country itself, and it had sort of like significant industrial depth. Also, on the commercial side, there was a sort of the U.S. Sort of civilian economy was also one of the strongest in the world. And what the U.S. had was this integrated approach between the defense and the commercial side. So they had the U.S. defense, sort of like the U.S. techno-security system had a significant dual use component where the military and the civil parts of the systems were able to sort of like collaborate and use economies of scale, economies of innovation. So you had, for example, sort of the big corporations would, like Boeing or Lockheed Martin, would both do defense and commercial, sort of like under one roof. And the universities and the innovation system were also doing sort of like a military and civil things. So this combination of both civil and military and the dual use allowed the U.S. to be able to sort of like use these combined strengths to be able to be sort of more competitive, sort of like, and in the end, this led to the U.S. being able to win against the Soviet Union, sort of like at the end of the 1980s, and also to win against Japan in sort of like during the 1990s. If we move to today, the Chinese techno-security state is in many ways, if you look at in terms of the civil military and the dual use nature, is more like the US. And it's like, and this is the fundamental difference between the old Cold War, where this compartmentalization between the Soviet Union and Japan allowed the US to have sort of like the strong advantages. The Chinese techno-security system is sort of like, in structural terms, much more similar to the US. And this sort of like poses significant competitive issues that the US is trying to face. The big difference between the US and the Chinese different systems is not in terms of the civil military sort of integration side of it. It's the main difference is between the nature of the state. In China, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Chinese techno-security state is very much of a top-down, state-led system. The U.S., in general terms, and this is very sort of an ideational itself, but the U.S. is much more of a bottom-up, of a market-led approach to innovation, to defense development, etc. And so the way that we sort of look to assess the strengths and weaknesses between the US and the Chinese techno-security states is not in terms of the levels of military to civil sort of interactions and sort of like the defense and the civilian systems, but to look at it in terms of from a governance, from a vertical approach to these issues. And I'll go into that in a little bit. So that's sort of like the historical context. So what I want to do is to do a little bit more of a dive into looking at the Chinese techno-security state and how it's evolved and developed under Xi Jinping. If there are any academics in the room itself, I know academics, it's like they look at PowerPoints and they always ask, so where are your footnotes and where are your references? So I wrote a book about this, and if you're interested, there's 700 footnotes to support this. Okay, so just in case someone says, where are your sources? I can give you sort of the references. So I would say that there are four important pillars of the Chinese techno-security state, and that's what I want to sort of like give you sort of a very, very short summary of each of these pillars so that you can understand what Xi Jinping has been emphasizing in his development of this technology security juggernaut. So first is national security. And in many ways, sort of Xi Jinping has worked very hard over the 12 years he's been in power to build what I call sort of a national security state. But the issue to understand is Xi Jinping sees national security very differently than what we normally think about as national security. So when Xi Jinping comes to power, sort of in 2012, the Chinese strategic community, the Chinese government, the Chinese military, they see national security sort of in international relations jargon. We would say the traditional Chinese approach was that it was China was sort of like saw security in very neo-realist terms, in terms of sort of like sort of the external environment, balance of power, sort of like and sort of like dealing with sort of international hierarchy, sort of anarchy itself. And that meant that there was a division between domestic security and external security. Xi Jinping, I mean, he was sort of like a long-serving sort of party apparatchik. He spent much of his career working in the Communist Party system, and so when he comes to Beijing, he begins to say, well, national security should be seen differently, and he said national security should be seen in terms of political security or regime security, which sort of like in China, that meant that sort of political security meant that it was important, essential in fact, to secure and guarantee the Communist Party's hold on power. And so when you look into national security from that perspective, then sort of the world becomes a more sort of a less benign and a much more threatening place, because political threats, political challenges can come sort of domestically, can come externally, and can come from all sorts of directions. And so this is why sort of Xi Jinping uses terms like sort of China faces sort of black swan or gray rhino events, that things that can come out of the blue that can threaten to undermine sort of like China's security. And so over the next few years, Xi Jinping focuses on building sort of a national security strategy that sort of he calls a holistic security outlook that says that China faces the most complicated internal and external factors in its history, which is sort of a paradox, because sort of anyone who was looking at China, especially Chinese security, in the years that Xi Jinping comes to power, actually thinks that China is probably in its most sort of like secure and advantageous position that it's been for many, many decades, at least sort of like since the establishment of the People's Republic. But the Chinese leadership thinks very differently. That it's like it says it's the most complicated security sort of environment, and that's sort of like very, very sort of counter to what a lot of other people think. The second pillar, also sort of as Xi Jinping comes to power, is that when Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012, sort of like this is at the tail end of sort of China's sort of high-speed economic development. Sort of like sort of when Deng Xiaoping came to power at the end of the 1970s, sort of China begins to supercharge its way in terms of economic development. The next few decades, on average, there's double-digit economic growth. But this economic growth, which is sort of export-led, sort of like sort of a mass production approach, is beginning to run out of steam as Xi Jinping comes to power. Economic growth begins to fall to sort of the high digits, and then begins to get to the sort of into the mid single digit levels. And the writing is on the wall. And Xi Jinping looks at sort of like the economic circumstances and thinks, well, it's like we really have to sort of change the nature of economic development. And for him, from the time he takes power and to today, he sees that the only answer to the slowing economic growth is innovation. And innovation sort of fairly broadly defined, but primarily focused on technological innovation. And so he spends the first few years that he's in power to develop sort of a new long-term sort of economic development strategy, as well as military development strategy, which is what he calls the innovation-driven development strategy, which is sort of this long-term plan that he sort of identifies to the mid-30s and even beyond to sort of the middle of the century, in which the focus is on becoming sort of like a first-tier innovation power by the mid-2030s, and then become a strong global innovation power by 2050 to begin to challenge for global leadership itself. And there's various aspects of innovation that he emphasizes. One is when he comes, it's like, what has been the most successful approach to China's science and technology and innovation development over the past few decades was what we call an absorption-based approach, right? That China identifies the best global technologies, the best global knowledge, and brings it in and absorbs it. And then what the Chinese term is, they re-innovate. They develop sort of like foreign technologies as their own, and they sort of say, well, it's like, and they reverse engineer and make it sort of Chinese branded. I mean, great examples of this Chinese re-innovation is high-speed trains. On the military side is Russian technology that they sort of reverse engineer and make it Chinese, like fighter aircraft, like the Su-27 becomes the J-11B, etc. And this is a tried and tested and very successful model, but the problem with this model of absorption-based is that you're always following, you're always catching up. And what Xi Jinping wants to do, especially as with this innovation-driven development strategy, to the mid-2030s, is that he wants to move it to what we call an original innovation-driven model, in which like sort of the sources of knowledge and technology are driven by basic research and development within your own countries. But it's like, but the shift is not very easy because the absorption-based model was based sort of on an engineering approach, right? This reverse engineering approach. The original innovation model is like you have to sort of seed your own research and development base, which requires sort of having world-class universities, requiring sort of like sort of the scientists rather than the engineers taking charge, and that takes a lot of time. But but Xi Jinping is very committed to this. Then the third pillar is the importance of what Xi Jinping calls military strengthening, or what we in the West would call sort of like sort of rapid pace military modernization. Xi Jinping, although he has very little background on military affairs, when he becomes sort of the paramount leader, one of his titles is Commander-in-Chief, the chairman of the Communist Party Central Military Commission. And he goes and talks to his military chiefs, and he says, well, the military is very, very big, but it's not very powerful. So how do we strengthen the military itself? And strengthening the military means the focus on quality versus quantity. And that is sort of like done in science and technology terms itself, but by itself, that is not enough. Science and technology, developing the weapons and the equipment, is only one portion. It has to be a much more sort of comprehensive, holistic approach. It also means in terms of innovation, sort of innovation in doctrine and strategy. It also means innovation in organization. So what we see over the next sort of decade or so is a wide array of sort of like major reforms and developments to change sort of the both the People's Liberation Army and the defense industrial and innovation systems into a very, very differently orientated and organized apparatus. And this is ongoing as we speak. And then the fourth phase, and this is sort of like going back to that chart about sort of the military and the civilian systems, is how do you fuse the military and civilian systems together? And Xi Jinping develops this concept of military-civil fusion in the mid-2010s. I mean, it's, this is a term that's often used sort of like in the West, that this is sort of the magic weapon that allows China to be able to sort of like become a very powerful techno-security state, which is that the military sector can leverage the increasingly advanced, the increasingly sort of like prosperous commercial sector to sort of like to bring the military system up to advanced levels. The problem is that military-civil fusion sounds easy on paper, and of course Xi Jinping is very powerful, but the Chinese economic and defense systems have traditionally been very segregated, very compartmentalized. And this compartmentalization was built into the Chinese system at the very beginning of the People's Republic. So when Xi Jinping talks about sort of how to fuse these systems together, there's powerful political, bureaucratic, and corporate interests that says, we're not really interested in this. The defense industry, they have monopolies. So it's like if there's this fusion, this undermines their sort of corporate sort of identity and and monopoly on profitability. The military is keen, but the civilian sector, I mean, especially the private sector, they have very little interest in sort of like sort of helping to sort of going into business on the with the military, because the military has all sorts of rules and regulations, a lot of secrecy issues, a lot of red tape, and it's like and they don't like newcomers to supply. So there's a lot of structural and normative and historical impediments. So that military-civil fusion sounds good on paper, but it hasn't really progressed as fast as we expected. And also military-civil fusion. It became to be identified sort of in capitals in Washington, D.C., in Europe, and et cetera, as I said, as this sort of like sort of magic weapon that the Chinese Communist Party could use to accelerate sort of China's military development. And so in 2019, China no longer officially used military-civil fusion. So after 2019, you cannot find military-civil fusion in any of the official documents. Xi Jinping doesn't talk about it, et cetera. But there's a new term that Xi Jinping has begun to use, especially since last spring of March of 2023, which is this notion of national strategic integration. So this is sort of like my term, the actual term that Xi Jinping uses is, he talks about the development of an integrated national strategic system with capabilities itself. This is sort of a vague idea, but something that has become increasingly important. And this is sort of like military-civil fusion, but at another higher level. And the focus is to how do we sort of like integrate the economic development and national security development of the Chinese state and fuse it together, not just at the military-civil level, but at the national level itself. And we've seen sort of like a lot of focus on national strategic integration, sort of within sort of like the policy community, sort of amongst strategic thinkers in China, and this is particularly important, especially after, sort of since the 2022 Ukraine war, because some of the lessons that the Chinese are learning, especially given that there's a lot of focus about sort of what to do with, in case they have to go to war with Taiwan, is how do you sort of develop a national strategic system in China that will help to support the military if they have to go to war. So whenever people talk to me about military civil fusion, I say, well, we have to really use the term of art in China today, which is national strategic integration. So those are the pillars. And I'll give you sort of a very sort of brief sort of how this is, these different sort of pillars and the overall techno-security state has evolved over these last sort of 12 years of Chinese rule. As sort of like, as I mentioned, sort of national security is now very much seen to be political security. And political securitization was the principal focus of Xi Jinping in his first term in power. So that's from 2012 to 2017. This is the period of the 18th Party Congress, where the focus of the leadership was on domestic security, ideological integrity, and sovereignty. And so political security becomes very, very important. So sort of from Xi Jinping's second term, this is when sort of the great power competition with the US begins to pick up and become of increasing concern. And this is sort of like when we talk about great power competition, a lot of the focus is in the economic realm, where the US begins to impose sanctions and export controls against Chinese technology firms, and tariffs are being introduced. And so the focus then in Xi Jinping's second term begins to emphasize economic security, or what I define in China as economic securitization. And so this is when the state pays a lot more attention to issues such as supply chains, issues as technological self-reliance, issues of sort of like developing strategic reserves in energy, in food, and many other areas of this itself. And so economic securitization becomes sort of the defining emphasis during Xi Jinping's second term. And then I would say that in the last couple of years, especially sort of around sort of 2021, 2022, with the Ukraine war, but also as tensions build up in the Taiwan Straits, there's a sense that there's sort of a militarization taking place within the Chinese techno-security state. And what I mean by militarization is that, which is distinct from military modernization, which has been going on with the military strengthening effort, is military strengthening is primarily takes place within well-defined boundaries. And military modernization takes place within the military and defense establishments. Militarization is when the emphasis on building military capabilities spills over beyond the military and defense domains into the broader economic and societal domains itself. So one example that I sort of give, and there's lots of other types of examples, is that at the 20th Party Congress, towards the end of 2022, a new Politburo, the 24-member Politburo, is appointed, and for the first time, sort of like in the People's Republic of China's history, there's 4 people from the defense industrial apparatus that become members itself, which equates to almost 20% of the membership. And this is a sign that sort of the defense industrial apparatus is beginning to spill over into the political. And it also is in the bureaucratic realm, where defense industrial officials are also appointed to key ministries, like the Ministry of Industry and Information technology, etc. And there's other types of them, but we are beginning to see where it's like sort of militarization as defined in this, where it's the spillover into sort of like broader parts of the economy by the defense and military apparatuses are beginning to be seen itself. And this is the explanations from those. So, I mean, as we see the Chinese techno-security state sort of evolve and build and become more powerful and become more expansive, this is also leading to intensifying rivalry with the US. The US techno-security state is also ramping up its competition against China. And we see this from a number of areas. Defensively, the US techno-security state is building up sort of like its defenses in terms of export controls, in terms of sanctions regime, etc. And a key part of this these defensive measures, or what sort of like the U.S. administration talk about, is like building high walls and small high walls and small gardens. Is sort of like how does the U.S. prevent China not just from catching up in areas such as semiconductors and other high tech, but just to stop China from making advanced progress in these areas, full stop. Offensively, sort of like the U.S. is forging sort of like very targeted and very sort of assertive techno-security alliances. We see like the main example is with Australia and the UK with the AUKUS alliance that's focused on building sort of like nuclear submarines and a whole range of emerging and advanced technologies with military applications. And the US is also, on its own, is pouring significant resources in research development and production to develop sort of like capabilities that will try to offset China's quantitative advantage through sort of very high quality areas itself. So the US has been sort of a little bit slow in the game. The Chinese have been engaging in this sort of like advanced sort of military technology development, sort of dating back sort of a couple of decades. The US has really only paid attention to China sort of in the last sort of seriously in the last five to 6 years itself. So I wanted to have a couple of concluding thoughts itself. And this is the issue, and I get asked this very often, is like, so does the rise of a militarized Chinese techno-security state, does that make the chances of war with its neighbors or with the US more or less likely itself? So from what we see, is the Chinese techno-security state sort of like a major source of instability and sort of like that might end with war? And the other big question is, what is the cost of this sort of techno-security burden, especially as it becomes more militarized? And can China afford it? I mean, these are very, very big questions that would take me another 2 hours to answer. But I thought it'd be worth throwing that out because it's like, I mean, those are the types of critical existential issues that like helps us to build when we think about sort of the implications of the rise of the Chinese techno-security state. And I'll just briefly comment on that itself. I mean, so an important difference is that sort of when I say sort of, I've been talking that the Chinese techno-security state is going through a process of militarization. Militarization is distinct from this other term that is often used and sort of often sort of like conflated with militarization, is militarism. What we see in China is not militarism, which is the glorification of the use of military force and the use of military force for its own sakes. I mean, I don't see the Chinese techno-security state as very eager to go to war. In fact, I mean, I think, the chances of war between China and the US has been growing, but I still think it's relatively limited. I mean, there's more chance of China going to war with some of its regional neighbors, more in the South China Sea than in the Taiwan Straits. And so a lot of what we see in terms of the long-term strategic competition between the US and China in the techno-security state, I mean, I would see it as sort of in the area of peacetime or hybrid or gray zone competition, and crossing over into actual full-scale military conflict is still a high bar, which is still very difficult to cross. And another important point is that often militarism and the increasing process of going to war is often equated where the military is in the driving seat. An important thing about looking in terms of China, in terms of civil-military relations, is that the Communist Party, and particularly Xi Jinping, as in charge of the Communist Party, is firmly in control of civil-military relations in China. The military are very careful, not to overstep their bounds in political decision making. And then, lastly, the question of how costly is this techno-security burden? And in in the book that I wrote on the Chinese techno-security state a couple of years ago, I mean, it's like my estimate of the Chinese techno-security burden was around 5 to 6% of GDP, which is actually it's expensive, but it's affordable. I mean, when the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the old Cold War, at the end of the 1980s, the defense burden that the Soviets had to deal with for several decades was in the range of 20–25% of GDP. That was unsustainable. So at the 5 or 6 or even 7% level, which is what the US is also at itself, this is a level that China can sustain over the long term. The question is, if militarization becomes more expensive and there's a lot more that goes on, then that's another question itself. So I'll end it here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if anyone has.
Thank you, Professor Tai. That was very comprehensive and very refreshing approach. I have a couple of questions, basically, based on your presentation. My first question is, as you said, the initial idea was basically Xi Jinping trying to secure the regime support for CCP. Now, is it also a variant of what Mao talked about, CPC's permanent struggle? I mean, you're always looking for some real or imagined enemies. And then what he has done, targeting his opposition, targeting the future adversaries or challenges, was it also a side shoot, or was it also a main agenda? And second one is, look, both issues, the techno and the security issues, how far Xi Jinping is confident enough to achieve what he has started? Because when it comes to security, when it comes to military, I don't think he's that confident in PLA. I mean, if you were that confident, you will not purge 2 of your recent defense ministers out of the system. So is he capable, is he confident in PLA? And also, is he confident in China's technological development? I mean, can it match with them? And third question is, with Trump coming, and as you have also mentioned in your papers, that Trump himself started talking about this national security innovation base in 2017, and his whole approach of MAGA, the Make America Great Again, it's also basically a techno-security approach. So how far there are chances of colliding with each other, and how do they play? And finally, As you mentioned that political securitization and economic securitization has already been in place. How did COVID play there? Did it hit Chinese economy? Are we looking at all those indicators right now? Does it tell us that this securitization is complete? How far they have achieved this? That's it.
Four very easy questions that I'll sort of take an hour to answer for each one. Okay, just to be comprehensive. Okay. So the first question is like I mean it's like sort of Xi Jinping sort of like and sort of a real or imagined sort of enemies in terms of how he conceptualizes sort of the security system. I mean it's sort of I would say that as it's like I mean when Xi Jinping comes to power, it's like I said, it's like his predecessors saw that China sort of enjoyed a very sort of like benign international security environment. Yes, there was rising tensions. They had problems with Japan and in Taiwan, in the Taiwan Straits and other areas, but those were sort of like limited, and China could handle this itself. And so I think it's like Xi Jinping then, so like sort of many ways, so like sort of identifies these sort of challenges that were not really there itself. I mean, it's when he comes to power, one of the first things that he does when he talks to other party leaders, he says it's like we have to look at sort of like sort of the lessons of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And people at that time, it's like this is in 2012. It's like the collapse of the Soviet Union. I mean, China in 2012 is so far removed from where the Soviet Union was in the late 1980s, and a lot of people say, so why do we have to study the lessons? Because the Soviet Union was a centrally planned economy with a failing sort of economic structure, etc. China in the early 2010s was a globally connected, very, very sort of increasingly prosperous economy. And Xi Jinping says it's about how the Soviet Union sort of like neglected the role of the Communist Party itself. And it's like, and so that sort of begins to take you back to another era, as you said. It's like this is almost sort of a Maoist approach, identifying sort of sources that sort of allows you then to sort of deal with enemies, imagined or real enemies. And also sort of during this period of time, I mean, it's so sort of the focus then is ideological rot domestically within the Communist Party. So this is when they launch anti-corruption and ideological purity efforts. But then it's also, they begin to say, well, I mean, there's all these countries, especially the US, is trying to undermine us. And so that's when you begin to get sort of like, so the emphasis sort of like on sort of like on a much more assertive, sort of like hyper-nationalist approach. Yeah, so I think it's, and a lot of this sort of like sort of approach then sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So by today, it's like the foundations that Xi Jinping lays means that the US and China have actually sort of come full circle. And it's like, wow, sort of like, it's 12, 15 years ago, they were enjoying a very sort of like strong, sort of like, and trusted relationship. And now that trust has all gone. And so it's like, I think Xi Jinping started this, but then it's like it reached a point where the US also very much joined in, and now it's this self-fulfilling circle on both sides. On the second question is like, how confident is Xi Jinping in both the military and China's science and technology development? I mean, I think there is a side of him that is very confident. That is like that he thinks that China has the resources and the prosperity, and it also has the talent What most important Xi Jinping talks about, it has, or he often calls about, the superiority of the socialist system, which means the ability to mobilize and bring together. It's like the authoritarian nature of the Chinese state, to bring all these sort of like organizational methods to mobilize and then focus on sort of what he focuses on: breakthrough technological development and also military development. So he says, like, we have the capabilities to be able to do that. But then he also is realistic, and he says, yeah, we have all sorts of issues. So whenever he talks about, yes, it's like we have to build a world-class innovation system, he says, but we have these weaknesses that if we don't tackle, sort of like bureaucratic inertia, sort of like a lack of sort of really world-class talent, etc., then where sort of like inefficiencies, corruption, etc., then we will fail. So we have to pay attention itself. And in terms of the military, it's like, I mean, I think Xi Jinping is worried about the military. I mean, sort of Xi Jinping understands that if it's like his predecessors were, so especially Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, and to a little bit extent of Deng Xiaoping, they were not able to gain authoritative command of the military because, especially Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, they didn't have the military experience, military background to get sort of like the recognition by the military, etc. And Xi Jinping didn't have that. So what he's done, rather than sort of using sort of like sort of that experience which he lacked, he went on a major purge of the military using an anti-corruption sort of mechanisms, and then using that, he sort of built sort of a military sort of command and control system where it's like in the past you had a check and balance system of the military where you have the political commissars who are always overseeing the military warfighters. So that was the check and balance. So this is sort of the political control over the professional military. What Xi Jinping's put in place is a double check and balance system where you have the political commissars and you checking the professional warfighters. But then to check the political commissars and the warfighters, you have what they call the discipline inspection apparatus, which is the anti-corruption force, and they are there to look at that. So now, if you're a professional warfighter, you have two groups of people checking on you. And what do you think that does in terms of sort of military confidence, military cohesion, when it's like sort of like there's all these sort of checks and balances, etc. But yeah, I mean, so to me, that is a fundamental structural weakness that is not apparent because China has not gone to war. But if you actually go to war and you go to war against sort of like an advanced adversary, these is potentially sort of like fatal flaws. I've only answered two of your questions itself, so I'll go briefly to the sort of like sort of in terms of the U.S. and sort of and the oncoming Trump administration. Of course, we have to wait and see what is going on. But I mean, it's like the U.S. Has been significantly accelerating its investments in its military. The U.S. defense budget is now at 850 sort of billion U.S. dollars, and I think it's this is only going to become sort of even more sort of like an important priority. The problem, though, is I see is that so within sort of the different coalitions that forms the power base for Trump, there's a lot of sort of like sort of major differences. There's one which is the budget hawks, and they form a major part, especially in Congress, and they want to cut back on sort of like on U.S. government spending and U.S. government debt, etc. And they are very opposed to significant increases in defense spending, and so they will be sort of a major issue. You have the traditional defense hawks who are there, but they've become less and less powerful within the policymaking apparatus. And then you also have this other wing, which I would say is like sort of people such as sort of like sort of Elon Musk, etc., which is like they want the government to be much less involved on technology and innovation. They see things like the CHIPS Act, or which is like a part of industrial policy. It's like the government should not be involved in this type of thing, which I think is like makes it sort of difficult then for the U.S. government to be on the Techno-Security State to be able to mobilize and deal with a lot of these areas, because a lot of these sort of new sort of emerging technological areas like AI, biotech, etc. Often it's you need a balance between the state and the market to take place, and if it's just the market, it often is not sufficient. So I think it's like we will see who of these wings gets to dominate. And then lastly, on COVID itself, and I'll be very, very brief. COVID zero in its initial phases was a testament to sort of the success of the Chinese Techno-Security State, to be able to mobilize and to deal with sort of like this major pandemic that came out from the blue, etc. And the Chinese were able to mobilize its health capabilities. The military were very much involved in that, and they talked about this war against COVID, etc. And they were able to like to do COVID zero very, very effectively. But the issue was that it just kept going on and on. And towards the end, what was a source of strength, the massive state intervention, became a source of weakness. That prolonged, excessive state intervention led to mass distrust of the people. And so I would say sort of the final conclusion was that COVID zero at the end was like if we use the analog about sort of like the Communist Party's sort of final tally of how good was Mao Zedong. He was 70% good, 30% bad. I would say COVID was about 40% good and 60% bad.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Now we'll take some questions. Dr. Joshi.
This is, you had partly responded to Atul's second question. Has the Chinese educational and research and development system developed enough momentum to overcome the US small yard, large fence situation? Because I was reading a survey in Bloomberg magazine which says that in 5 out of some 12 areas, the Chinese are now world class, and in those other 9 out of 12, they are competitive. And in one area only, they have a problem, which is on commercial aircraft. And there is also this ASPI survey, which says that 12 out of 13 military technologies, the Chinese are ahead. And you have various other analyses like this Nature magazine, which comes out, which says that the Chinese science and science is doing extremely well. So I just wonder whether there is sufficient momentum in what the Chinese have already got to be able to spring surprises, maybe, let's say in quantum technology, they could spring surprises, which would then leap over the kind of fence that that has been put up. The second question is that, the US is just cracking down on migrants. One of the strengths of the US has been migrants. Science and technology in particular has benefited from migration, migrants, and the US is now turning its back on them. And China, of course, never had this large-scale migrants assisting their science and technology, except they had the 1,000 Talents program, but the 1,000 Talents, again, the Chinese are no longer speaking about it. See? So can you tell us something about this?
Those are also very good questions itself. I mean, so this question about sort of like how sort of technologically, or how capable China is in terms of science as opposed to on the technology. Yes, I've seen all these surveys. I would say that, I mean, without doubt, there are increasing pockets of excellence within the Chinese science and technology system, where they are becoming sort of like at the frontier itself. But I would sort of be cautious in saying that sort of like in the majority of areas, as the ASPE survey sort of like, or even some of the media reporting is, that they've sort of overtaken the US and and now in the advance, because sort of like a lot of those sort of like surveys, sort of like the methodology that's used to sort of like identify China is sort of like is bean counting, right? So you count sort of how many publications, etc. That is like, and how many patents, etc. That is sort of like sort of only partially useful, and a lot of it is about sort of how you sort of fully introduce a lot of these systems and sort of into the marketplace, and then how it's sort of disseminated. And I would say sort of like in some in a small number of areas, the Chinese are there, but I think in the vast majority, China still has a number of steps. And I mean, it's like, and we have to look at sort of like apple to apple comparisons. So often it's like in the area of AI, it's like we often see like Chinese AI and the US AI, they're sort of a similar quality. But what the Chinese are good at is in terms of being able to get access to a lot of data, because they're able to leverage sort of within their own system. They are much weaker in terms of sort of like the innovation, a lot of the algorithms, a lot of the basic research on that. And in the area of generative AI, the Chinese are significantly weaker. They've caught up in some areas, especially sort of like in generative AI sort of version 4. But the US is looking to power ahead sort of soon in versions 5 and 6, etc. I mean, the overall sort of analog I would sort of say is like so amongst sort of Chinese scientists, etc. I mean, it's like they have what sort of is often described as the Nobel Prize complex, which is sort of like how does the Chinese scientific community sort of like win Nobel Prizes, not for peace or other sort of prizes that they are not interested, but in terms of sort of basic science on sort of physics, chemistry, maths, and those things itself. And right now, I mean, you have Chinese, but mostly sort of overseas Chinese based in the US or elsewhere, winning Nobel Prizes in the sciences, etc. But sort of really sort of there's no Chinese who have won a mainstream sort of a Nobel Prize in the sciences. There's someone who sort of did some traditional Chinese medicine, but that's sort of not sort of on the mainstream side. But what the Chinese are is like they're beginning to win prizes sort of like just below at the Nobel Prize. Like for example in maths, the Fields Medal is like, and the Chinese are winning that. So the Chinese are still sort of like one level below at the very top itself. And I think this is sort of like sort of where that is. And of course, getting to the Nobel level, that's the hardest final mile to do that. But it's just a matter of time. I mean, the Chinese are like, as you sort of mentioned, I mean, like, they have a very large talent pool. Xi Jinping pays particular attention to sort of human talent development. I mean, yes, we don't see the Thousand Talents program, but they've really doubled down on other types of talent programs, and they're sort of and they're sort of like in their recent policy documents, it's like, how do we incentivize that talent, etc. So this is a story that still has a long way to go itself. And then the last question you said, it's about sort of the U.S. Can you ask that again?
I was talking about migration.
Okay, migration. I mean, it's like, so, I mean, migration across the board, yes. I mean, the US is cracking. I mean, to me, it's like, it's migration, but also about sort of like the US science and technology system being a global player, where you are able to have sort of both migration. You can allow sort of the top sort of intellectuals and researchers and scientists to come and stay. But it's but that's one part of it. But also it's like, do you allow scientific exchanges where you can collaborate with anyone sort of like in China, etc. on that, and sort of like and my university system, University of California, we've been going through this where it's like there's been a major sort of like sort of crackdown on allowing sort of Chinese scientists sort of both to come, whether to immigrate or to sort of to come and visit and do exchanges in that way. And so the question is, can the US sort of science and technology innovation system sort of like work as a closed door or as an open door system? And I think it's like right now it remains open, but especially sort of under the second Trump administration. I mean, in the first Trump administration, especially focused on China, you had sort of the FBI had the China initiative that cracked down on a lot of sort of like China-born scientists, and sort of like, and that led to a major exodus of Chinese who emigrated, but then they went back because they felt sort of like unwelcome and in danger. If you have a continuation of that, sort of that will have a major impact itself. So I think there's the immigration side, but there's this broader question about even those who are there, sort of finding it. It's just the US is not a friendly place now.
Let's take a couple of questions this time. Rahul?
Thank you, Professor. My question is centered around this context of war in Ukraine and how it is fiercing the great power competition. And given the fact that US is coming up with its own defense industrial base strategy and is trying to shift, the industrial bases from China and maybe taking them towards their ally countries and focusing more on building tech collaborations. So this in a way has implications with the US strategy set in motion to actually come up with a strategy of technology come resource denial to the countries like China and Russia. So simply US has come up with more of a export control specific regulations for, let's say, China and Russia. So I want to understand what kind of implications it can have for Chinese this techno-security base, because ultimately these resources and their fungibility will have implications for their military capabilities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. My question concerns the internal security of China. It is regarding the surveillance that has been increasing and ramping up with focus on technology, including face recognition technologies and biometrics and all that. Do you feel it is ramping up to a necessary point, or it is just becoming unnecessarily dystopian? If it is becoming dystopian, will there be resentment amongst the Chinese public which will show up at a larger scale?
Introduce yourself as well, okay?
Hello. Yes, sir. So my name is Harsh Thakur. I'm from first year Hindu College. I have a couple set of questions. Firstly, like you spoke about economic securitization in China. Since 2020, we have seen a trend of technological clampdown on companies like Tencent, Alibaba. And in that, we have seen all sets of antitrust, data security laws, and even forced exits for companies from core sectors, non-core sectors. So how do you place this in this economic securitization context? And it follows from the fact that the recent $1.4 trillion package which they introduced, it has failed on the market scale, at least in the stock market. So how do you place this? Secondly, the question is, the Deng's period has seen a rapid economic growth due to the decentralized model. And now you have mentioned about a top-down model under Xi. So how is this economic growth? Is it getting affected because of the change or the shift that is happening? And thirdly, and the last question, that is, you spoke about militarization, which is happening right now. And we are also looking at this, I'm connecting this with the technological growth. Like China is right now leading in fusion reactors research. And even they broke down like a month ago, it is argued that the Shanghai University cracked the RSA 256 encryption. So in that context, what do you see is next after militarization? When is militarization going to end and what is going to be next? That's it. Thank you.
Question. Hello, can you hear me now? Yeah. So I just wanted to ask you the implications of Quad with China would be seeing. Quad has been made for a specific purpose, and all the 4 countries have their specific game plans on those. I mean, I can't say game plans, but their own views. How do you think it's going to impact China, the Quad, the rise of Quad in the area, in the ocean down and South China Sea and America and Japan, India and Australia? How do you think they plan to work on these?
So there's 4 questions and a number of sub-questions within them itself. So the first one about sort of like, I guess sort of like the US-led sort of alliance, sort of techno-security alliance structure and how that's sort of impacting upon China itself. I mean, it's, I mean, if you look in terms of sort of like the networks, the alliances that the US and China has in the techno-security space, the US has by far the most extensive and the most powerful itself. And especially under the Biden administration, they've put sort of building partnerships with allies at the very sort of center of dealing with China itself. And this has been extremely effective, especially in semiconductors. But we're also seeing it moving in other areas. And in many ways, this is a sort of like this sort of the globalization of this techno-security competition is one of the weaknesses of China, because sort of outside of China, I mean, the only really sort of like serious sort of partners that the Chinese have is with Russia. And of course, that's very, very complicated because of the Ukraine war. And then, of course, there's Pakistan. But it's really sort of, it's more of a one-way relationship that China has with Pakistan. So in terms of sort of like this global contest in the techno-security sphere, it's one that I think the US is winning, but the issue that we see for the incoming Trump administration is that this was a major source of weakness for the Trump administration. That in the first Trump administration is that there was a lot of distrust and a lot of worry that the administration was sort of very transactional and that they didn't really care about the traditional historic fabric of close relationships. So, I mean, in Europe, of course, the big question is, does the US remain within NATO, et cetera? And I think the issue going forwards with the second Trump administration is that will they continue to build upon these major sort of these techno-security alliances that the Biden administration has done, and we haven't heard very much yet. But it's like the one that's of real concern is AUKUS. Will the U.S. remain committed to AUKUS, where they have to sort of be in partnership with the Australians and with the British, or because of the America First philosophy, that these types of sort of like norms are relegated to secondary, and it's about sort of these other countries have to sort of like sort of consider American interests first. So I think it's the U.S. has built a very, very strong position on this, but it could equally undermine its own self without the Chinese doing anything on this. The second question is about sort of like about the internal security sort of state. It's like, I mean, I think it's under Xi Jinping, he's built a very, very powerful internal security state where the surveillance and the technological aspects have already been sort of like laid down, and the heavy investment done in his first couple of terms. So they can continue to build out, but they really already have a very, very effective sort of system where they can monitor whatever people do. I mean, in recent months, there's been concerns that there's been a slowdown in investment in the public security apparatus, in technology capabilities, because so much investment has already taken place that it's like a lot of the firms, like Hikvision and others that supplied a lot of this type of technology, they are no longer getting the types of orders that they had. And there's only so much you can build on that. So I think, China has what? Obviously, like sort of, they have hundreds of millions of cameras. They have all sorts of like of fusion centers, etc. So the Chinese sort of surveillance state is already there. The issue now is that with the domestic market pretty much saturated, can they export this? And there's like there's a lot of interest in other countries, especially in Africa and other authoritarian states, that sort of like sees that the Chinese sort of domestic security model can be applied to that. So I think in terms of looking at in terms of the future of all of the Chinese tech sort of domestic surveillance state itself, it's less to do with the domestic dimensions and more to do with exporting that at the global level itself. And then thirdly, sort of on economic securitization. So I can't answer all the questions, but it's like, but I'll sort of answer one itself. And it's sort of like, it's the Chinese party-states relationship with the private technology center. As you rightly point out, it's sort of like, it's a love-hate relationship, and there was a crackdown, sort of like, sort of what we call the regulatory storm that took place in 2021, 2022, where people like Jack Ma and Pony Ma and other sort of like of the lead in sort of like private technology companies, they stepped down or sort of went into sort of semi-retirement because it's like sort of they were seen to be challenging sort of like the Chinese party state. I mean, sort of one interesting thing is that in the last couple of years, the sort of Xi Jinping has put forward a new way about thinking about how you organize sort of like the relationship between this state system and the state-owned enterprises with the private sector sort of and private companies, and and the notion is like what he calls a new whole of nation model of development. The new whole of nation model is contrasted with the old whole of nation model. The old whole of nation model was what the Chinese built in the 1950s and 1960s to build their nuclear weapons and their sort of strategic ballistic missiles. And this was what they called the 2 bombs and 1 satellite system. And this old whole of nation was about, especially on science and technology development, was about vertical integration. That you integrated sort of like within silos, within your particular industrial silo. So it was a nuclear or space or missiles. And so vertical integration was the approach, which worked very, very effectively in the industrial era. The new whole of nation approach is more about horizontal integration. And horizontal integration means that it's not just about the vertical system where a lot of it is state-owned, but horizontal is you pick and you choose the best players for that technology development. And this could be within the private sector, it could be within the state sector. So they're at their very early stages of doing this. And if this horizontal system is truly horizontal, then the top-down perhaps can be mitigated. But but we haven't seen too much evidence about how this is going. So this is a very, very, very important sort of trend. And we have to wait to see how this evolves over time. And then lastly, sort of the issue of Quad, right? I mean, Quad is one of those sort of mini latros that the Chinese have been paying a lot of attention to. Less on the technology side, more on the broader security side. But it's like, but in terms of sort of like priorities, I think AUKUS is much more of a direct concern and threat to China than the Quad itself. And sort of the Quad is, the Australians are playing there, the Japanese, sort of like, and the Indians. The Chinese are watching that carefully, but they haven't really sort of taken major steps to respond to that. They're more worried about sort of like, as I said, with Australia, with AUKUS, with Japan, with the CHIPS 4 alliance, and other sort of areas of focus, but it's a second order area of focus for China. Okay.
We'll take last round of questions, and please limit your questions to only questions, no comments.
Thank you, Professor, for that question, for your presentation. I'm Abhishek. I'm a research assistant at ORF. My question is, how do you think that the upcoming Trump administration and their policy and its impact on the techno-security state? Because there are a lot of commentaries that Trump may remove CHIPS Act, IRA, and these were important initiatives to kind of consolidate the techno-security state. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Danny Antonio Martin. I'm from Amity Institute of International Studies. I'm a second year bachelor student. I just wanted to ask, what do you infer from the recent path towards normalization of relations between India and China? Do you consider it as a course correction, or is it an elimination of a front while in the new Trump administration that is coming?
Hi, Professor. I'm Rahul, independent consultant at the intersection of tech and geopolitics. My question is a sub-question to the last question. We're sitting in New Delhi. India is China's neighbor, and I guess the obvious question is, besides just the de-escalation on the recent, or the recent de-escalation on the long-standing crisis, what would be India's approach at the highest level with the limited time that you have to what you see as a clear, Chinese techno-security state's development? Just principle or framework level conversation. Thank you.
Professor, it's Sanero Tyagi and I'm the law graduate. So my question is, at what level does the president keeps the issue of respecting the territorial sovereignty of other countries in his policy? And second is, taking reference through the question of Dr. Atul, why would PLA trust Xi Jinping? Thank you.
My question is regarding the Dr. Joshi pointed out migration issue. I think Chinese are not interested to have a green card or staying back. They go there for a few years. They work there. They learn technology. I mean, they learn reverse engineering or stealing the data and go back to China and advance their technology in China. So, do you think Chinese technology will be interrupted because of now Trump? He will not be allowing to Chinese people to do all this reverse engineering or stealing data and all this thing. And the way he was pointing out all this Corona, when Angela Merkel was there, she highlighted the issues of China should be punished for $3 trillion. They have done harm to the whole world. So what happened to Angela Merkel issue? Why she is silent now?
The first question is about the Trump administration and how it's going to sort of deal with the Chinese Techno-Security State, etc. I mean, there's two ways that you can deal with the Chinese Techno-Security. First is it's defensive, that you build more and more sort of restrictions, and you sort of cut back even further. And this is what we're seeing already. I mean, but the Biden administration continued on with that, so we would likely see more of that. But the most important is, can the U.S. sort of pursue more offensively to compete, and to do this, it's you need a greater role for the state, especially in areas of technological innovation, of industrial policy, and all that. But as I said, it's like we've already seen the limits of that. And if Trump brings into his inner sort of circle of decision makers, people like Elon Musk and others, where they have a very very skeptical approach to the role of government, etc. I think this will lead to a much less robust approach by the U.S. in using the considerable powers that the state has in supporting research, development, and innovation. And if you just limit it to the market, that's going to be far from sufficient to be able to challenge China. So, we'll have to wait and see who gets appointed and in which positions. But if we see the jockeying for power, and we see the likes of these pro-market anti-state skeptics take charge, then the U.S. will forfeit a lot of its strengths in that area. And then the second issue, in terms of Sino-Indian relations. It's always a dance, right? So it's one step forward, two steps back, a few steps sideways, etc. And to me, it's the recent de-escalation, I mean, these are tactical steps. They don't sort of see any sort of major strategic developments. And so we will have to see a lot more of this. We need to sort of see several other sort of approaches. And until we see that, I just see sort of yes, this is good in the near term, but there's no real sort of trends or follow through in taking place. And I think the default position remains that China and India are very sort of distrustful of each other, and they're focused on sort of building up their own capabilities. And so for India, I mean, the best way to compete, of course, is both domestically, but sort of to become an increasingly important part of the international coalition, sort of to engage with the US and other countries on a lot of these areas. But the Indians, I don't think, are willing to do that. I mean, that's a step too far still itself. But that is an important area. But of course, also it's I mean, there's the problems with the Russia question, especially sort of as it pertains to the US. And then sort of the question of about the president and territorial sovereignty. I mean, sort of Xi Jinping sort of has made clear that in terms of core Chinese interests, sovereignty and territorial integrity are one of the three core interests for China. And there's no negotiations on that, etc. So, and sovereignty and territorial integrity means that China has sort of full control. It's and there's no stepping down on issues dealing with the Taiwan or in the South China Sea, etc. And I think that is and Xi Jinping has made that very, very clear. That is his strong position itself. And then it's on the question of so sort of Chinese going to the US and then going back to China after sort of spending time there. I mean, I actually think, I mean, the evidence shows that, I mean, a lot of Chinese, it's when they go to the US and they study for their PhDs or advanced degrees, and they stay in the US, etc. Many of them don't go back. It's and a number do go back, but it's there's better opportunities there. But it's but there's a large number of Chinese who go to the US, who sort of believe in the US system. A lot of them don't like what's going on in China, and I think it's and that's sort of very good for sort of the US system. It's sort of I mean, sort of at my university at UC San Diego, I mean, the most sort of the two most important sources of sort of new science and technology blood are from China and from India itself. And I think these are important sources to build sort of sort of the continued US lead in research and development. Yes, you do get some Chinese going back, but you also see more and more Chinese trying to leave China because of what is going on in there itself. So so I think it's it's important for the US to continue to welcome sort of Chinese, whether they've lived there and they can and they work there. But as we saw, as I said, under the second Trump administration, that welcome map may not be as welcome as we've seen in recent years. Sorry? So I didn't hear that. Marco. Righty. I mean, I don't know where she got that figure is itself. I mean, it's there was a figure done by a U.S. commission on on the theft of Chinese, on Chinese theft on cyber, that gave a figure of 1.5 trillion, etc. I mean, it's like whatever. I mean, these are sort of political figures, right? And if there was a global court that you could sort of take China, sort of like and prosecute them, then you might do that. But it's like there isn't. The Chinese deny all of this, so a lot of this is in the court of public opinion. I mean, in terms of is like any compensation, there's no chance of that taking place. What countries have done is that they realized for quite a long time that they were very lax in sort of preventing Chinese espionage as sort of like and Chinese stealing, and so they have to sort of build up these sort of capabilities and to prevent the Chinese from taking up. So what they have to do is look at what's going in the future as opposed to what is already taking place, because the Chinese are not going to sort of admit to anything. So you really then have to prevent these types of actions from continuing in over the long term.
Hi, that was very comprehensive and very informative. I guess when you look at this Chinese techno-security state from Washington, D.C., and if you look at it from New Delhi, we get two perspectives and two kind of ideas to cope up with. With that, a lot of thanks for coming and sharing your ideas.